Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, pilotless planes, collateral damage, and the numbers game. The coverage of the drone story.
Covert strikes have killed hundreds of militants.
Julian Assange, the asylum seeker. The man from WikiLeaks takes diplomatic cover. More and more governments are going to Google to get online political content offline. And Somali reporters, 6 of them have been killed this year, and Al-Shabaab is not the only danger they face. George W. Bush liked to call himself a war president. Barack Obama may well go down in history as the drone war president. There has been a rapid escalation by the Obama administration in the use of what the Pentagon calls unmanned aerial vehicles in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. According to the London-based Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the BIJ, there have been 280 drone strikes on Pakistan alone since Obama took office, which is more than 5 times as many as the Bush administration ordered in its last 4 years. The BIJ also reports that at least 482 innocent bystanders, civilians, have been killed by American drones. The CIA reports a much lower collateral damage figure of just 60 civilians. We're going to look at the numbers, how the U.S. government calculates them, and the lack of critical scrutiny the American media bring to this story. Recently, both the president and his CIA chief were the subjects of extended interviews about national security with U.S. news networks, neither of which even raised the drone program. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C., but it may as well be just across the state border in Langley, Virginia, where the CIA is taking part in a series of wars fought by remote control.
There seems to be a firewall around the US in terms of mainstream coverage of the drone strike.
U.S. drone strikes. A drone strike
killed in a U.S. drone strike. The problem is not the quantity of the coverage, but instead sort of the nature of it.
Shrouded in secrecy.
Decapitating Al-Qaeda.
It will be a strike.
Then much of the reporting has been Washington-centric. There's very little reporting from the ground.
The news itself comes from the one who is carrying out the strikes, and this is how they report it.
This is the paradox of the Obama administration.
The news coverage of the Obama administration's drone war took a turn just under a month ago, on May 29th. That was the day the New York Times broke a story that explained, at least partially, the discrepancy in the civilian casualty figures between what journalists in the war zones were seeing and what Washington was saying.
I think that New York Times article has actually changed the way that people are now reporting on the drone program. It revealed that the Obama administration actually counts anybody who's of military age that's killed in a certain region where Al-Qaeda is known to be as a militant. So in other words, the only way to prove innocence is after death and proving that they weren't in fact involved in the terrorist group.
Any adult male in Waziristan these days, we're told, is fair game. And the only way a civilian can be defined is after the event and posthumously. And actually, even there, when we've supplied the CIA with named civilians they have killed, they've spat it back in our face. The civilians have no chance of being recognized as such by the CIA under their present methodologies.
According to the U.S. government's methodology, 16-year-old Tariq Aziz was a militant. According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, he was in Waziristan armed with only a camera given to him by a Pakistani human rights organization to document drone strikes and their impact on Pakistan's civilian population.
This young boy, Tariq Aziz, when he goes back after the training, 3 days later he is killed. And when we say this thing to the media reporters and we filed a case about this, what we get to hear from CIA is that they completely deny. They say that they have killed a 16-year-old boy, but he was a militant.
Tariq Aziz is just one case. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism says there are 320 named cases like his in Pakistan alone. And those are just the names they know about. More civilians have been killed in drone strikes in Yemen and Somalia. Yet the Obama administration maintains that no more than 60 civilians have been killed by drones in Pakistan, and that is the figure that often gets reported.
One of the really frustrating things is that there are still media organizations, in spite of that New York Times story, that continue to just recite the government statements about how many militants were killed or how many civilians were not killed.
Privately, U.S. officials say the covert strikes are legal,
without making clear that the government uses the word civilian in this very unusual way, and that it uses the word militant in this very unusual way.
The uncritical use by most of the U.S. media of the administration's numbers, its narrative, is part of a disturbing trend in American journalism that news consumers have been seeing in the post-9/11 era. When it comes to matters of national security and intelligence, the government plays the access card and most journalists play along.
But our 60 Minutes team was given secret clearance and unprecedented access.
So how it works normally is that they talk to individual reporters and leak information, and then that reporter does not name the official who has leaked it, but everyone in journalist community knows that it's CIA source which is leaking that source.
It's a rewards-based system that we've seen emerge in Washington, where national security correspondents in particular, if they play the game, they get the goodies, they get the morsels. But when you stop playing that game, or if you don't even play that game to start with, you're cut off at the knees. You don't get access.
And there hasn't been any challenging. No one has challenged the numbers or any of the important issues, such as the legality of the program itself. I think, thankfully, that has changed, but only recently. And considering how long the program has gone on, I think that's quite surprising.
Actually, drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties.
The White House did not even confirm the existence of its drone program until just 6 months ago. That was not under questioning from the American news media. President Obama made the admission during an online Google Talk forum. Since then, journalists like NBC's Brian Williams and CBS's Scott Pelley, who are paid millions to anchor network news shows, had prolonged interviews on national security with both the president and his CIA director. But somehow, neither journalist asked a specific question about the drone program.
The First Lady, she's at dinner.
It turned out the lightest thing on board was the heart of the man with a world of worry.
The inside the Situation Room was hagiography at its best. I mean, Ceausescu would have been pretty proud of that had it appeared on Romanian TV 2 decades ago.
Good job, National Security Team.
It was an appalling piece of television.
In your official life, where does this day rank?
There's a particular sycophancy among particularly broadcast journalists in Washington right now towards administration figures.
The vast majority of that coverage has been extremely deferential, not just failing to ask questions, but essentially glorifying the program.
But Leon Panetta has held the toughest jobs in Washington and quietly done what seems impossible.
And part of the reason that the United States is now at war in more countries than even Leon Panetta can manage to remember in a TV interview.
In how many countries are we currently engaged in a shooting war?
It's a good question.
Why don't we see President Obama or Leon Panetta in an interview where he's actually asked some strict questions, and not that how great it is and how much time they spend on selecting a target to kill? Can we go a bit further to explain that these 3,000 people who have been killed in drone strikes, who exactly are they, and what was the level of their militancy, and what was the level of threat they posed to U.S.?
One final note. A little more than a month ago, there was a drone strike in southern Yemen. Within minutes, the story broke, not on an international news channel, and certainly not on an American one. It was tweeted, almost in real time, by Yemenis. As one observer put it, some of the same digital technology used to fight the drone war from the sky is now being used by people to report it on the ground. And that's something to think about for governments that want to wage covert wars in this, the age of information. Our Global Village voices now on the coverage of the drone story.
I find Pakistani media's coverage of drone attacks slightly more nuanced than that of their US counterparts. One, in terms of civilian casualties, and they try to report them as best as they can. And two, in terms of how Pakistanis view these drone attacks as an intrusion into Pakistan's sovereign space. Now, you will never hear such nuanced coverage of the drone attacks in the US media.
All the reports that we get are verified only by official sources because they're the only ones that have authority over this, as journalists lack access. Hence, all we find out about is a number of militants that are unidentified, and in reality, a lot of them are innocent civilians.
It's time now for Listening Post News Bites. WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange, who is fast running out of safe havens, has requested political asylum in Ecuador. Assange walked into Ecuador's London embassy and asked for protection under the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. The move came less than a week after the UK's highest court rejected Assange's final appeal to avoid extradition to Sweden, where police want to question him about allegations of sexual assault that date back to 2010. Assange has maintained that those charges are politically motivated, and he has said that extradition to Sweden could eventually lead to him being sent to the U.S. on charges of espionage or treason over WikiLeaks' release of U.S. government documents. Ecuador's embassy in London released this statement. We have immediately passed his application on to the relevant department in Quito. While the department assesses Mr. Assange's application, Mr. Assange will remain at the embassy under the protection of the Ecuadorian government.
I can hear you, President Correa.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Julian Assange recently interviewed the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, for his talk show on the state-funded channel Russia Today. It is unclear whether the issue of asylum was discussed when the two men talked.
Where are you, in England?
I am in England under house arrest.
Assange also has until June 28th to appeal the latest UK court decision at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. There's another media story brewing in Ecuador where broadcast regulators have gone on a closing spree, shutting down 6 radio stations and 2 TV channels within the space of just 2 weeks. On June the 11th, La Pantera 960 AM, a radio station that had been on the air for 59 years, was told to stop broadcasting and its equipment was confiscated by the police. The official reason given, the station had not paid its license fees, the same rationale offered when other outlets were taken off the air. However, their managers say the real reasons are political, not procedural. Government critics will view these moves as part of a broader campaign against private media in Ecuador. President Correa has accused private media groups of operating a dictatorship and has filed a number of lawsuits against journalists. Correa has also said he's considering ordering his ministers to stop giving interviews to profit-making media companies altogether. Mexico is to the Americas what Somalia is to Africa. It's the most dangerous place to be a journalist. Victor Baez has become the 4th reporter murdered in the state of Veracruz in the past 2 months. Baez was a crime reporter for the daily newspaper Milenio. He was abducted as he left his office on June 13th. Police found his body the following day. Officials said that a note signed by the Zetas drug cartel, one of the largest criminal gangs in Mexico, was found next to the corpse. Many journalists have chosen to leave Veracruz, but others continue to report in the face of enormous risks. Gina Dominguez, a spokesperson for the state government, recalled a conversation with Baez about why he refused to leave Veracruz. She says he told her, "We cannot and should not live in fear and darkness. We won't let them impose terror on us." Western governments appear to be stepping up their efforts to censor material online. In its latest report on transparency, Google has revealed that requests from Western democracies to take down political content have risen by 25% in just 6 months. The countries highlighted in the report include Spain, Canada, Britain, and the U.S., and the online material causing offense often relates to terrorism, politicians, and other public figures. The report covered the period of July to December 2011 and showed that on average Google complied with 65% of the court orders it received. Dorothy Chu, Google's senior policy analyst, said it's alarming not only because free expression is at risk, but because some of these requests come from countries you might not suspect, Western democracies not typically associated with censorship. To be a journalist in Somalia is to take your life and put it in the hands of others. A half-dozen reporters have been killed there this year. And Al-Shabaab, the militant group that has imposed Sharia law in parts of the south, is not the only threat. There are no official regulations on what you can or cannot report in the 3 main regions, Somalia, Somaliland, and Puntland. However, journalists who criticize the government, Al-Shabaab, or certain clans and their leaders do so at their peril. Somehow, though, that hasn't seemed to stem the growth of the media sector or the flow of young journalists into the field. There are hundreds of radio, TV, and print outlets quenching the Somali thirst for news, and most operate in a hostile environment. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on journalism in and about Somalia.
April 4th. An explosion rips through the first anniversary celebrations of Somalia's state satellite channel, Somali National TV. Several were killed and many more, mainly journalists, wounded. May 24th. A radio journalist is shot dead in Mogadishu. Ahmed Ado Anshur was the 7th journalist murdered from the same organization. It's been a deadly few years for the Shabelle media network.
No news network has been targeted as much as Shabelle. Several journalists have been killed there in recent years. Now, one of the reasons I think for this is because they are one of the few independent media organizations that exist in the country. Al-Shabaab sees them as an enemy, and they receive regular death threats from the Islamist group. But it's not just Al-Shabaab. There are unconfirmed reports that recently, in an interview, the mayor of Mogadishu told Somali website that he was going to wipe out all of the journalists at Shabelle News Network.
Shabelle Media Network operate in the most volatile part of Somalia, Mogadishu and nearby towns and villages. And also they do cover quite a lot of sensitive issues or topics. So the reasons why Shabelle Media Network lost more than any other Somali media organization could be because they are based in Mogadishu, or it could be because they cover sensitive stories. Nobody really knows.
If you're looking for answers, you could be looking a long time. Al-Shabaab, one of the most notorious armed groups operating in Somalia, used to claim responsibility for murdered journalists. But over the last few years, the blame has been shifting, and Al-Shabaab is by no means the only suspect.
The threat doesn't come from Al-Shabaab only. The threat comes from all sorts of people, actors, all sorts of people who don't want these stories to come out. If you look at the last 5 victims, the last 5 journalists who got killed, I think none of them were killed by Al-Shabaab. They were killed in Galkayo and other places in the government-controlled areas. So you can't blame only Al-Shabaab.
When you go around Mogadishu, you realize that almost every single politician or big business owner believes that they could either have an influence or become President, Prime Minister, Speaker of the House. A lot of these politicians are backed by clans. Now, if you, as a journalist, go against that particular clan, you can expect that your life expectancy will be cut short substantially.
Look at the number of radio stations or the number of TV channels that have been closed or been raided in the last year or so. Most of them, if not all, are not in Al-Shabaab controlled areas. So putting the blame solely on Al-Shabaab, I think that's oversimplification of the situation in Somalia.
An oversimplification. But Al-Shabaab has a history with Somali media. Its recent ransacking of Radio Markable, an independent station in the southwest, was typical of its persistent attempts to block both state and independent radio transmissions. It's the organization's way of countering the media message, transmitted by hundreds of Somali outlets, no matter where they're based. This is Universal TV's headquarters, based not in Mogadishu, not in Hargeisa, not in Puntland, but in London. Since 2005, it has been transmitting daily news bulletins to Somalia's 3 main regions, and Somalis all over the world. And now this channel finds itself competing with other offshore news organizations, all of which are out to satisfy the thirst for news in and on Somalia.
The media landscape in Somalia has been growing since 1991, and obviously every single Somali person in the diaspora or inside Somalia wants to have some sort of information, whether it's news or programs about the political crisis in Somalia or about the life of Somalis in Somalia.
Somali people in general, they are actually very news oriented. They gather news all the time. Either it became a private or government or whatever, assault or whatever. They are more interested about what's going on. That's when they even shaking your hands, they tell you, do you have any news?
And these days, the series of attacks on Somali media is the news. But in a country plagued with corruption, to say that journalists are always victims would be simply inaccurate.
Corruption is rife. I always say to Somali journalists, we were meant to fight corruption. As journalists, we were meant to expose the bad guys. But if we are the bad guys, then how could you say, I am doing a good thing?
I was in a press conference, and as soon as the press conference finished, there was somewhat of a gathering towards one side. And I looked, and there was money being exchanged. And I was told, that is how it works. You want your story to be covered, you have to pay the journalist. You cannot defend that kind of behavior, but then when you know the journalist paid less than $50 a month, and they do have a family and people who depend on them. So it is a market industry.
The main issues in Somalia is the ownership of media houses. Most are bought or either controlled by private businesses, so there's a lack of independence there. And most of these people who own these media outlets belong to one clan or the other, so there is a clan-based agenda when it comes to journalism.
But corruption is just one of Somalia's worries right now. It's a country that's been torn apart by years of civil war, famine, drought, and piracy. And it's lucky hundreds of young Somalis are still queuing up to tell its story.
It's a tough job, and somebody has to do it. And somebody has to really convey the message that the other people are actually very keen to know. You have to either kill something or to be killed.
A person who summed it up for me was a journalist who worked at Shebele Radio. His name was Hassan Fantastic, and he told me that he understood the threats, he understood the dangers of working as a journalist, but he felt that he had to do it. He had to get the truth out.
And doing this job can come at a high price. On January 30th, Hassan Fantastic was shot dead outside his house. There is a real risk for young Somali journalists, but for the time being, it's still one many are willing to take.
More Global Village Voices now on the state of and dangers of journalism in Somalia.
The number of journalists and media outlets in Somalia is increasing on a daily basis, and the quality is also improving, given that there is a boom in technology and many of them are able to reach out to the worldwide network and tell the stories that no one else can tell. However, this brings unsafe consequences. Some journalists have already got killed in areas controlled by the government. Just gives us that extra insight that there's not always one group behind the killings.
Anyone who follows Somali news closely knows that you cannot blame one particular group for the routine attacks on Somali journalists. Unfortunately, they've been suffering for a very long time and in all the different parts of the country, regardless of who's in charge.
Finally, it is a sad commentary on the news business that when it comes to certain stories, sometimes we can learn more from a comedian or a satirist than a newspaper or a news network, and that is certainly the case with the drone war. We've featured the work of Mark Fiore in the past. The Pulitzer Prize-winning American cartoonist who does all his cartooning online has a knack for cutting right to the heart of an important issue. His take on this story is called Dronetopia. It's about the virtues of waging a remote control war, and it's our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Blasty, the magic drone. He's everything that's great. When you're in a fit, he just blows up.
Okay. Hi, I'm Blasty. You're gonna be seeing a lot more of me now that everything is coming up drone. It may not look like it, but since I fixed up Afghanistan for the USA, now NATO is going to spend billions for their very own drones, and that's dronerific. It feels just like peace when you're fighting war from your easy chair. While you're safe at home, I'm blasting bad guys and occasional innocent villagers who are clearly on their way to becoming bad guys. It's the drone recruitment effect. From Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen to selling drones to Iraq and Turkey, I'm on the leading edge of the coming Dronetopia, where my commander-in-drone can comfortably target U.S. citizens abroad. And Dronetopia is coming to a police force near you, but just for surveillance, of course. Dronetopia is so wonderful, who can blame other countries if they wanted to be part of it too and say, blast threats who are hiding out in other countries? I can do it all. Kill bad guys, kill good guys, fight wars, fight peace, wash your car, and even paint your house. So sit back, relax, and push that button, because thanks to Dronetopia, war has never felt so peaceful.